Frontier women were left to die by cruel settlers until Cheyenne found them and saved them. The land stretched for miles, endless and unforgiving. Rolling plains gave way to low hills, and beyond them the distant mountains rose like jagged teeth against the pale sky. The wind carried a chill that seemed to seep into the bones, and the sun, though bright in the daytime, barely warmed the earth. It was the frontier, a place where life was raw and survival depended on courage, skill, and often a little luck. For the women who had chosen or been forced into this life, each day was a test of endurance, and each night was a reminder of how alone they truly were. Martha, a woman in her early 30s, stood outside the small log cabin that she and her late husband had built the previous year. The roof sagged in places, and the walls had gaps that let the wind whistle through like a mournful song. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders and scanned the horizon. The earth was brown and cracked, the grass stiff from frost. Her children, young and restless, played near the edge of the small garden that had been planted with care. The seeds had barely sprouted, and already the cold threatened to destroy them. The women of this small settlement were no strangers to hardship. Their lives had been filled with the hard work of building homes, tending to animals, and growing crops. But this winter was harsher than any they had faced. Snow had come early, covering the plains in a thick blanket that made travel almost impossible. The settlers' supply wagons had not come, and rumors spread that the men of the nearby homesteads had gone off to fight or seek better lands, leaving the women to face the cold alone. Martha's neighbor Eliza walked up the narrow path between the cabins. She carried a small basket of frozen apples, the only food she had managed to save from the orchard. Her face was pale from the cold, and her hands were red and chapped. "They said the men might not return before the end of winter," Eliza said quietly. "We can't rely on them. We have to find a way ourselves." Martha nodded. She had known this day might come. Many of the men in the settlement were gone, seeking work or adventure, leaving the women to manage the land and keep the children alive. It was not an easy life, and the harshness of the frontier was unforgiving. Every decision could mean the difference between life and death. The women gathered in small groups, sharing what little they had. Food was scarce. Firewood was running low. The frozen ground made hunting difficult, and the nearest river was partially iced over, making fishing dangerous. Despite their fear, they tried to keep their spirits up, telling stories by the fire, singing soft songs to the children, and teaching them small lessons about survival. Each moment of warmth felt like a victory against the cold that seemed determined to take over. But danger did not come only from the weather. Some of the settlers who remained were cruel and selfish, hoarding food and refusing to help those in need. Rumors of fights and thefts spread through the small community, and the women knew that survival depended not only on skill and courage, but also on trust, and trust was in short supply. One afternoon, as the wind howled across the plains, Martha noticed smoke rising from a distant cabin. She hurried over, heart pounding, fearing that a fire had broken out. When she arrived, she found that the settlers had set a small fire, but it was surrounded by empty wagons and abandoned belongings. No one was there. It was a reminder that danger could come from both nature and man, and that the women were left to fend for themselves. Despite the hardships, the women refused to give in. They worked together, sharing what little food they had, splitting tasks to keep the cabins warm, and tending to the children as best they could. At night they would huddle together, whispering stories of hope and courage. They remembered the times when the men had helped, the laughter and care they had once known, and they clung to those memories as a reminder that they were not entirely alone. Winter dragged on, and each day brought new challenges. The children grew hungry, and the animals weakened from the cold and lack of food. Martha and Eliza ventured into the woods to collect firewood, careful not to wander too far from the settlement. The snow made every step difficult, and the cold bit through their gloves and coats. Yet each bundle of wood they brought back felt like a small victory, a reminder that they could survive even when the world seemed determined to defeat them. Tension in the settlement grew. The women knew that the settlers who had remained were watching them, some with curiosity, others with suspicion or outright hostility. Martha noticed that certain neighbors avoided her gaze, whispering behind their hands. She realized that the frontier was not only a place of natural danger, but also of human cruelty. Those who had power and resources used it to control and intimidate, leaving the weak to struggle alone. As the days passed, Martha began to think about the stories her mother had told her as a child. Stories of courage, survival, and unexpected kindness. She remembered how, even in the darkest times, help could arrive from the most unlikely places. But right now, with the snow piling up and supplies running low, it was hard to imagine that help would come. Fear and worry were constant companions, but Martha refused to let despair take hold. She knew that if she gave up, there would be no one left to care for the children. no one to keep the small community alive. One morning, as the sun rose over the frozen plains, Martha and Eliza heard the distant sound of hoofbeats. Their hearts leapt with hope. Could it be a supply wagon? A returning settler? They ran toward the sound, only to find that it was a lone rider, a stranger they had never seen before. He looked weary and tired, and though he offered greetings, it was clear that he had come from far away. He had no supplies, no news of other settlers, only the knowledge that the winter would be long and cruel. Martha realized then that they could not rely on outsiders. They would have to find strength within themselves, to survive on their own terms. They could not wait for help that might never come. The women of the settlement gathered together, forming a plan. They would hunt what they could, gather wood and water, and protect each other and their children. Each day would be a battle, but together they might stand a chance. As the wind whipped across the plains, carrying the scent of snow and frost, Martha looked out over the settlement. She saw the small cabins, the children playing despite the cold, and the determined faces of the women who refused to give up. The frontier was harsh and unforgiving, but it had also brought them together. In the midst of fear, cruelty, and isolation, they had found courage and resilience. They had discovered that even in the most difficult times, hope could survive, and that survival depended not only on strength, but also on unity, trust, and the willingness to face each challenge, no matter how terrifying. Martha took a deep breath and turned back to the cabin. There was work to be done, fires to tend, and plans to make for the long winter ahead. She knew that each day would bring new challenges, but she also knew that they would not face them alone. The women of the frontier were strong, and they had something more powerful than fear: the determination to live, to protect their children, and to survive no matter what. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the frozen plains. Martha and the other women gathered around the fire, sharing stories and keeping watch over their small community. Outside, the wind howled, carrying with it the promise of more snow, more hardship, and more danger. Yet inside, the fire burned bright, a symbol of resilience, courage, and the quiet hope that even in the darkest times, life could continue, and that somehow help might still arrive when it was needed most. The days grew colder, and the snow deepened across the wide plains. The small group of women huddled in their cabins, their bodies stiff from the chill, their hands raw from chopping firewood and caring for the children. Every movement was a reminder that survival was not easy. The wind carried a sharp, icy bite, and at night it seemed to moan through the gaps in the walls like a warning that danger was always near. Martha stood by the window watching the snow swirl across the frozen ground. Her children played quietly inside, building small forts from blankets, trying to keep warm. She had learned to watch and wait, to notice the small signs of trouble before they became larger problems. But even with her careful eyes, she could not escape the truth. Supplies were running dangerously low. The dried meat had almost disappeared, and the small cache of grain had dwindled to only a few handfuls. The thought of running out of food made her stomach twist in fear. Eliza came in, her face pale and lined with worry. "I tried again," she said softly, placing a small basket on the table. Inside were a few frozen roots and some dried berries she had gathered from the nearby woods. "It's not much, but it will have to last another day or two." Martha shook her head, trying to hide the worry in her eyes. "We need more," she said. "We need to find a way to survive until spring. The men, if they ever come back, might be too late." Her voice trembled, but she did not let it show to the children. In this world, even a small sign of fear could weaken the spirit of those around you. The women decided to venture further into the woods to find supplies, though it was risky. The snow was deep, and the cold made every step painful. They wrapped themselves in thick layers, carrying small baskets to collect whatever roots, nuts, or berries they could find. The children stayed behind with a few women to tend the fire and keep watch over the cabins. As they walked, Martha noticed signs that others had passed through the woods recently. Footprints in the snow, broken branches, and the remains of a small campfire told her that settlers or travelers had been near. But instead of feeling relief, she felt a creeping unease. Some of those travelers might not be friendly, and she had heard stories of settlers who were cruel and selfish, taking what they wanted from those weaker than themselves. By mid-afternoon, the women had gathered a small collection of edible roots and dried berries. It was not much, but it would keep them alive for a few more days. As they started back toward the settlement, a distant shout carried across the plains. Martha froze, listening. It was hard to tell where it had come from, but it sounded urgent, almost desperate. The women looked at each other, fear in their eyes. When they reached the settlement, they found the cabins in disarray. Some had been broken into. Supplies were missing, and small signs of struggle, Broken boards, footprints in the snow showed that the women had been violated, their work undone. Martha's heart sank. The settlers who had stayed behind, the ones they had once thought could be counted on, had taken what they wanted and left the women with nothing. Eliza clutched her basket to her chest. "They left us to starve," she whispered. "All of this for nothing." She looked around at the empty cabins, the bare shelves, and the children who stared in confusion and fear. How can anyone be so cruel? Martha did not answer. There was nothing she could say to make it better. She felt a deep anger rising within her, but she knew that anger alone would not save them. They had to act quickly, or the winter would take them. The women gathered what little food they had managed to save and huddled together in the largest cabin, locking the door and piling blankets against it to keep the wind out. Night fell, and the temperature dropped even further. The children huddled close to the fire, trying to keep warm, while the women whispered plans in hushed tones. They knew they could not rely on the men who had abandoned them, nor on the cruel settlers who had taken their supplies. They would have to survive on their own. Days passed, and the women grew weaker. Hunger gnawed at their stomachs, and the constant cold made it hard to sleep. Each morning they awoke to find frost covering the windows and ice forming along the edges of the cabin walls. They huddled together, sharing body heat and whispering encouragement, but the fear of running out of food pressed on them like a heavy weight. Martha decided they needed to take a greater risk. She and Eliza, along with 2 other women, set out early one morning, venturing farther than they ever had before. They trudged through the snow, searching for a stream that had not frozen over completely, or perhaps a wild animal that had been trapped by the snow. Every step was exhausting, and the cold seeped into their bones, making their movements slow and painful. They found a small creek partially hidden by trees, where the ice had not yet formed completely. Carefully they melted snow over the fire to drink, and they caught a few small fish using handmade traps. It was enough to give them some strength, but it was not nearly enough to feed the entire settlement. Martha realized that their survival depended on more than just finding food. It depended on hope, courage, and their ability to work together. Returning to the cabin, they discovered another betrayal. A small group of settlers, who had been watching the women's movements, appeared at the edge of the settlement. They demanded food and firewood, showing no concern for the children or the women's suffering. Martha and the others stood their ground, refusing to hand over what little they had. The settlers laughed and threatened them, but Martha's voice did not tremble. "We have nothing more to give," she said firmly. "Go away, or you will get nothing at all." The settlers eventually left, but the encounter left a bitter taste in the women's mouths. They realized that cruelty was not just an abstract threat. It was real, and it could come from anyone. The frontier was not a place for the weak, and they had no choice but to become stronger than they had ever imagined. They discussed ways to protect their cabins, to ration their food more carefully, and to teach the children how to survive in the harsh conditions. Each conversation was filled with a mixture of fear and determination. They knew that winter would not last forever, but until it ended, every day was a struggle against starvation, exposure, and the cruelty of others. One evening, as Martha watched the children sleep, she felt a deep sadness. She thought about the families who had been lost to the cold, the settlers who had abandoned their duty, and the uncertainty of what lay ahead. But even in the darkest moments, she found a spark of hope. The women had survived so far. They had faced betrayal and cruelty and had not given up. They had each other, and together they could face whatever came next. Martha's thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the cabin door. Her heart leapt with hope, only to fall again when she saw a figure standing outside. It was one of the cruel settlers, a man who had taken supplies from the women earlier. He demanded more food and warmth, showing no concern for the children huddled inside. Martha's voice was steady as she refused him again. She did not know if her courage would be enough, but she knew that surrender would mean the end of their survival. The man left, muttering threats under his breath, but the women's resolve had grown stronger. They reinforced the doors and windows, secured their small cache of food, and prepared for the long nights ahead. Hunger was a constant companion, but fear would not control them. They learned to take small victories wherever they could find them. A small basket of berries, a few fish from the creek, a night when the fire burned long enough to chase away the cold. Days turned into weeks, and the women grew more skilled at surviving in the harsh conditions. They learned to read the signs of approaching snowstorms, to recognize the tracks of animals, and to make the most of their limited resources. Each challenge brought them closer together, building a quiet strength that no cruelty could break. They learned to depend on each other, to trust in their own courage, and to face each day with determination. Yet even with their growing strength, the weight of loneliness and fear pressed on them. They longed for the return of the men who had promised help, or for someone who would bring news or supplies. Each day without aid was a reminder of their vulnerability, but in those moments, Martha reminded herself and the others of a truth they had learned the hard way. Survival depended not on waiting for others, but on their own courage, intelligence, and unity. The women of the frontier faced a world that had turned against them. Cruelty, hunger, and bitter cold were constant threats, but they refused to be defeated. They continued to work, to plan, and to care for the children, and deep in their hearts, they held on to the hope that help might still come, even from the most unexpected of places. The snow continued to fall thick and heavy, covering the plains in a blanket of white that seemed endless. The women had grown weary, their hands stiff from chopping wood, their faces pale from hunger and cold. Nights were the hardest, when the wind howled like a living thing and the fire's warmth seemed barely enough to keep the chill from creeping into their bones. Yet, despite the exhaustion, they carried on, determined to protect their children and survive. One morning, as Martha scanned the horizon for signs of the men who might return, she noticed something unusual. At first it was just a movement in the distance, a shadow crossing the white plains. She squinted, trying to make out what it could be. Then she saw more shapes, several figures riding across the snow, their movements steady and purposeful. Her heart leapt. Could it be settlers bringing supplies? Could it be help finally arriving? She ran to Eliza and the others. "Look, someone's coming," she said, pointing toward the horizon. The women gathered at the edge of the clearing, eyes wide with hope and fear. They had learned the hard way that not all travelers brought kindness. Some brought cruelty, taking what they needed and leaving destruction behind. As the riders drew closer, the women could see that these were not the settlers they feared. Their clothing was different, decorated with patterns and colors unfamiliar to the frontier. The women's hearts raced. Could they trust these strangers? Martha's mind raced with warnings. The cruelty of those who had abandoned them still lingered in memory, making every stranger a potential threat. The riders slowed as they approached the settlement, and Martha noticed something remarkable. They were not men seeking to take, but warriors moving with care. Their eyes were alert, but not hostile. They seemed to study the settlement with understanding, as if they knew something the women did not. Martha's fear battled with her hope, and she took a deep breath, stepping forward cautiously. One of the warriors rode closer, raising his hand in a gesture of peace. He spoke words Martha did not understand, but his tone was calm and respectful. Another stepped down from his horse, carrying baskets filled with supplies, dried meat, fresh blankets, and firewood. Relief and astonishment filled Martha's chest. Could this really be happening? Could these strangers be here to help rather than harm? The warrior gestured toward the women and the children, motioning for them to come forward. Martha exchanged a glance with Eliza. "Should we?" she whispered. The fear that had kept them cautious for so long tugged at her, but the promise of warmth, food, and safety was too strong to resist. Slowly she led the women forward, their children clinging to their skirts, eyes wide with both fear and curiosity. As they approached, the women noticed the care with which the warriors moved. They did not rush, did not push, and did not demand. Instead, they offered blankets, helped lift baskets, and set up a small fire near the cabins. The warmth of the flames was a welcome relief, and the women realized that they were being treated not as helpless strangers, but as people in need of compassion. One of the warriors spoke to Martha in broken English, pointing to the supplies and then to the cabins. "Help." "Safe," he said simply. Martha nodded, understanding. They were offering help, not asking for anything in return. The weight that had pressed on her shoulders for weeks, the fear of starvation, the anxiety over the children, the cruelty of the settlers, began to lift, replaced by cautious hope. Over the next few days, the Cheyenne warriors worked alongside the women. They helped repair cabins, using materials that had been left behind or gathered from the forest. They showed the women how to build fires that burned longer and stayed warm despite the wind. They shared their knowledge of the land, pointing out where to find roots and berries that had not yet frozen, and teaching them how to catch fish in partially frozen streams. The women learned quickly, driven by necessity and curiosity. They watched the warriors with respect, noting the skill and care in every movement. Martha realized that these strangers were not only helping them survive, they were teaching them to thrive in a world that had seemed so hostile. She felt a deep sense of gratitude mixed with wonder. How had they found the settlement, and why had they come to help? The children, initially wary, began to warm to the strangers. The warriors treated them with kindness, showing them how to play simple games in the snow and helping them gather small amounts of firewood. Laughter, long absent from the cabins, returned in small bursts, filling the air with a fragile but welcome joy. Martha watched as her children smiled, realizing that for the first time in weeks they were not afraid. Yet the women remained cautious. Memories of betrayal were hard to forget. The cruelty of the settlers who had taken their supplies, the harshness of the winter, and the fear of the unknown all lingered. Martha reminded the women that while they could trust the warriors, they still had to remain vigilant. Survival on the frontier demanded both hope and caution, and they could not let themselves be complacent. One evening, as the snow fell gently outside, Martha sat by the fire, speaking quietly with Eliza. "I never thought I would see help like this," she said. "After everything we've endured, it feels almost like a miracle." Eliza nodded, her eyes shining with emotion. "They've saved us. Not just our lives, but our hope." They sat in silence for a moment, listening to the crackle of the fire, feeling a sense of peace they had not known for many weeks. The Cheyenne did not demand anything in return for their help. They shared stories of the land, of the animals and the seasons, and of their own experiences surviving in the wilderness. The women listened, captivated by the knowledge and wisdom that these strangers carried. They realized that survival was not just about food and warmth. It was about understanding the world and working with it, rather than fighting against it. Over time, the women began to feel a sense of belonging, even in the midst of the snow and cold. They worked alongside the warriors, learning to prepare food in new ways, to gather supplies more efficiently, and to protect their children from the dangers of the wilderness. Each day brought new lessons, and each night brought a sense of safety that had been absent for so long. The warriors also showed the women how to move quietly and carefully through the snow, how to recognize signs of approaching storms, and how to track animals for food. Martha realized that these lessons were invaluable. The women were not just surviving, they were gaining skills that would help them thrive long after the winter ended. As the days passed, a bond grew between the women and the Cheyenne. Mutual respect replaced fear, and understanding replaced suspicion. Martha felt a deep gratitude, not only for the help they received, but for the lessons in resilience and compassion. She realized that survival was not about facing the world alone. It was about finding allies, trusting in others, and learning from those who knew the land and the hardships better than anyone. One morning, as the sun rose over the snow-covered plains, Martha noticed the children running and laughing with the warriors, their fear replaced by curiosity and joy. She felt a surge of relief and pride. The children, who had endured so much, were beginning to heal, to feel safe and cared for. The settlement, once quiet and filled with tension, was alive with activity and hope. Martha and Eliza worked alongside the warriors to repair the cabins further, reinforcing doors and walls and clearing paths through the snow. They learned to ration their supplies carefully, knowing that winter would not last forever, but also that challenges were still ahead. Each small success felt like a victory, each shared meal a triumph over the harshness of the frontier. Despite the growing sense of safety, Martha knew that life on the frontier was never truly easy. There would be more storms, more hunger, and more challenges to face, but she also knew that with the Cheyenne by their side, the women had a chance to survive, to protect their children, and to rebuild their lives. The arrival of the warriors had changed everything, bringing hope where there had been despair and kindness where there had been cruelty. By the end of the week, the settlement had transformed. Cabins were repaired, fires burned brightly, and the women had learned to move through the snow with confidence. The Cheyenne continued to teach, guide, and protect, and the women learned to trust in their knowledge and compassion. Martha felt a deep sense of relief knowing that they had not only survived the harshest part of winter so far, but had also found allies who could help them through the remaining challenges. As the sun set behind the distant hills, casting long shadows across the snow, Martha looked out over the settlement. For the first time in many weeks, she felt a sense of peace. The Cheyenne had arrived like a gift from the world itself, bringing hope, warmth, and the knowledge that even in the harshest conditions, help could come from unexpected places. The women, once abandoned and betrayed, now stood stronger, wiser, and ready to face whatever came next. The morning sun rose over the snow-covered plains, casting a pale gold light across the cabins. The women had spent the night listening to the wind, but for the first time in weeks, their hearts were lighter. They had learned that the Cheyenne were more than strangers. They were guides, teachers, and protectors. Today, the warriors had suggested that the women and children travel with them to a safer place, a village where food and warmth would be more reliable. Though the journey would be long and difficult, the women realized it was their best chance to survive the harsh winter. Martha gathered the children and spoke quietly to the women. "We must be brave," she said. "The Cheyenne will guide us, but we must do our part. We will face challenges, but together we can reach a place where we will be safe. Eliza nodded, wrapping a blanket tightly around her small child. The other women, though nervous, trusted Martha's judgment. They had learned the hard way that fear alone would not keep them alive. Courage and unity were their greatest weapons. The journey began with careful steps through the deep snow. The Cheyenne led, moving gracefully despite the cold, their horses strong and sure-footed. The women followed as best they could, carrying children, baskets of food, and bundles of blankets. The cold bit at their faces, and the snow made each step heavier than the last. Yet, with every mile, the women's confidence grew. They had survived cruelty, hunger, and fear. They could face this challenge as well. The first days of the journey were the hardest. The snow was deep, and the wind howled across the plains, making it difficult to see and even harder to walk. The women learned to follow the tracks of the warriors, keeping close to the horses to avoid sinking too deeply in the snow. They discovered that moving slowly and steadily was better than rushing. Each step forward, however small, was a victory. The children struggled at first, their small bodies tiring quickly. The Cheyenne warriors helped by carrying the youngest and showing the older children how to walk carefully through the snow. Martha watched her own children, feeling both pride and relief. They were learning resilience in a way no classroom or story could teach. Every step through the frozen landscape was a lesson in courage and determination. Along the journey, the women learned much from the Cheyenne. They were shown how to find shelter in the trees during a storm, how to start a fire in wet conditions, and how to gather edible plants even in the frozen wilderness. Martha was amazed by the knowledge of the warriors. Every skill seemed practical, every lesson carefully chosen to help the women survive. Slowly, the fear that had weighed on her heart began to lift, replaced by a growing respect and admiration. One afternoon, as the group stopped to rest, a snowstorm swept across the plains. The wind howled and the cold grew sharper, forcing the women and children to huddle together for warmth. The Cheyenne quickly set up a small shelter using blankets and branches, showing the women how to create a barrier against the wind. They worked together, stacking branches and securing blankets to form a space that was surprisingly warm. Martha helped the children into the shelter, wrapping them in layers of blankets. She watched as the warriors moved with calm efficiency, their hands steady despite the wind. "We could never have survived this storm alone," she whispered to Eliza. Eliza nodded, eyes wide with gratitude. "They've not only saved our lives, but taught us how to live in this world," she said. The women realized that survival was not just about reaching a safe place. It was about learning the skills to face any challenge. The storm passed, leaving a sparkling white landscape behind. The journey continued, and the women grew stronger and more confident. They learned to read the land, noticing tracks in the snow that indicated the presence of animals or signs of danger. They learned to recognize the approach of storms and how to prepare in advance. Each day brought new lessons and small victories, and each night brought warmth and safety in the care of the Cheyenne. During one stop near a frozen river, the group found a small herd of deer trapped by the snow. The Cheyenne quietly moved to catch one, demonstrating the technique to the women without harm to the others. Martha watched carefully, noting how skill and patience could turn the harsh environment into a source of sustenance. The women assisted in preparing the food, learning how to cook it over open fires in ways that preserved flavor and warmth. The children, fascinated, observed and learned from a safe distance. As the journey continued, Martha noticed a change in the women around her. They were no longer frightened or timid. Each woman had developed a quiet strength, moving with purpose and confidence. Even when obstacles appeared, a deep snowdrift, a slippery riverbank, or the fatigue of a long day, they faced the challenge with courage. They had been forged by hardship, and now, guided by the Cheyenne, they were becoming resilient in ways they had never imagined. The Cheyenne also taught the women about the land's rhythm, about the plants, the animals, and the patterns of nature. They explained how the snow could hide dangers or lead to food, how the wind could carry messages, and how the forest offered both shelter and lessons. Martha realized that survival was not simply about endurance, it was about understanding and cooperating with the world around them. One evening, as the group settled near a small grove of trees, the children played quietly while the women prepared food. Martha and Eliza sat near the fire, speaking softly. "I never thought we could make it this far," Martha said, her eyes reflecting the firelight. Eliza smiled. "We've come a long way, and we are stronger than we knew. The Cheyenne have shown us that strength comes from knowledge and trust, not just courage." They shared a moment of quiet reflection, understanding that their journey was as much about inner growth as it was about survival. The days turned into weeks, and the group faced many challenges along the way. They crossed frozen streams, navigated deep snowdrifts, and faced bitter winds that cut through their clothing. Yet the bond between the women, the children, and the Cheyenne grew stronger. They learned to communicate without words, to anticipate needs, and to support each other through exhaustion and fear. The journey was becoming more than a physical movement. It was a lesson in unity and resilience. Martha noticed how her children had grown during this time. They were no longer timid or frightened. They walked with confidence, learning to navigate the snow, gather firewood, and observe the signs of the land. The women took pride in their children's growth, realizing that survival was about preparing the next generation, teaching them skills and courage that would last a lifetime. At one point, the group came across a large ravine, frozen over but dangerous to cross. The Cheyenne moved first, testing the ice and demonstrating the safest path. The women followed carefully, helping each other and the children across. Martha's heart pounded as her youngest child slipped briefly, but a warrior's hand caught them in time. Relief and gratitude filled her chest. She realized that trust, once given, could save lives. The Cheyenne shared more than just practical skills. They shared stories of their people, of courage and compassion, of lessons learned from the land and each other. The women listened, captivated, finding parallels between their struggles and those of the Cheyenne. They realized that hardship was universal, but so too was the capacity for kindness, wisdom, and resilience. By the time the group reached a safer valley where the land was less harsh and shelter was abundant, the women were changed. They had endured snowstorms, hunger, and exhaustion, yet they had emerged stronger, wiser, and more confident. Martha looked around at the women, children, and warriors. She felt a deep gratitude and admiration. Together they had survived challenges that once seemed impossible. As they settled in the valley, the Cheyenne showed the women how to build stronger shelters, preserve food, and keep their children safe. The women began to teach each other what they had learned, sharing skills and strategies, and preparing for the days ahead. Martha realized that the journey had not only been a path to safety, but also a path to knowledge, courage, and community. The women laughed and worked together, sharing stories and lessons around the fire. For the first time in many weeks, fear had given way to hope, and despair had been replaced by determination. They knew that winter was not over, but they also knew that they were no longer alone. They had found allies, teachers, and protectors in the Cheyenne, and they had discovered the strength within themselves. Martha sat by the fire that evening, watching the children play and the warriors move with quiet confidence. She realized that survival was no longer just about enduring. It was about learning, growing, and facing the world with knowledge and courage. The women had been abandoned before, left to fend for themselves, but now they had a chance to rebuild their lives with strength, hope, and guidance. The snow continued to fall outside, but inside the fire burned brightly. The women had faced the harshest challenges of the frontier and had emerged stronger for it. They had learned that survival was about trust, courage, and unity, and that even in the coldest, most dangerous places, hope could thrive. Martha knew that the journey was not over, but she also knew that they could face whatever lay ahead. Together, the sun rose gently over the valley, casting a warm glow across the snow-tipped hills. After weeks of harsh weather, frozen plains, and uncertain paths, Martha and the women looked around at the place where they would finally rest. The valley was sheltered, surrounded by tall trees and protected from the fiercest winds. A small stream ran through it, unfrozen and sparkling in the sunlight, promising water and life. For the first time in months, the women felt something they had not felt in a long time: peace. Martha stood beside Eliza, watching the children laugh as they ran near the stream. The women had grown stronger on the journey, but it had not been easy. Hunger, cold, and fear had tested them, and the cruelty of those who had abandoned them lingered in their memories. Yet here in this protected valley, they could finally breathe. The Cheyenne had guided them safely, teaching them not only how to survive, but also how to find hope in even the harshest conditions. The first days in the valley were filled with work, but the work was different now. Instead of fighting for survival at every moment, the women began to rebuild. They constructed stronger cabins, guided by the knowledge shared by the Cheyenne. The roofs were reinforced, the walls thickened, and small gardens were planted in sheltered spots where the snow melted early. Martha and Eliza worked side by side, carrying wood, helping the children, and planning for the weeks ahead. The Cheyenne continued to teach the women about the land. They showed them how to store food safely for the coming months, how to hunt and gather without disturbing the balance of nature, and how to use plants for medicine. Martha marveled at how much knowledge they had gained on the journey, skills that would help them survive not just this winter, but any future challenge. She felt a deep gratitude for the warriors, realizing that their guidance had saved more than lives. It had given them independence and understanding. The children, too, thrived in the valley. Freed from constant fear, they began to explore the snowy meadows and dense forest edges. They learned from the warriors how to track small animals, recognize edible plants, and move safely through the snow. Laughter filled the air once again, replacing the quiet fear and tension that had dominated the previous weeks. Martha watched her own children play and felt tears prick at her eyes. For the first time in months, they were free to be children again, and she felt a surge of hope for the future. Despite the peace, the women still carried memories of the cruelty they had faced. Martha thought often of the settlers who had abandoned them, who had hoarded supplies and left them to face starvation, but those memories no longer filled her heart with despair. They were reminders of what they had overcome. She spoke to the other women about it one evening as they sat around the fire, their blankets wrapped tightly around them. "We have faced cruelty, hunger, and fear," she said softly. "But we survived, and now we have a chance to build something better, to care for our children, and to help each other. We are stronger than we knew." The women nodded, their faces glowing in the firelight. They had learned a powerful lesson. Survival was not just about enduring hardship, but about finding courage, unity, and hope. As the days passed, the settlement in the valley grew stronger. The women organized themselves, taking turns caring for the children, tending to the cabins, and gathering food. They began to teach each other the skills they had learned on the journey: how to make fires that burned long and warm, how to identify safe plants, and how to move quietly and safely through the snow. Martha realized that the journey had transformed them all. Fear had been replaced by knowledge, uncertainty by confidence, and despair by determination. One day, as they worked near the stream, Martha noticed a group of travelers approaching. Her heart raced with caution. After all, not all strangers were kind. But as the group drew closer, she saw that they were settlers who had been traveling safely through the winter. They were surprised to see the women thriving and well-fed in the valley, a stark contrast to the abandoned and hungry figures they had expected. Martha greeted them cautiously, aware that trust had to be earned. The travelers were impressed by the women's resilience and by the help of the Cheyenne. Martha spoke of the journey, the challenges they had faced, and the lessons they had learned. The travelers listened with awe, realizing that the women had survived through courage, cooperation, and the guidance of the Cheyenne. Martha felt a quiet pride. They had not only survived, they had emerged stronger and wiser than before. Even as safety settled around them, the women did not forget the lessons of the journey. They continued to practice the skills they had learned, teaching their children and each other. They planted gardens that would provide food through the seasons, repaired cabins to withstand storms, and prepared for the long winter months. Martha realized that true survival was not just about reaching safety. It was about preparation, knowledge, and community. The Cheyenne remained with them for a time, guiding and advising. They shared stories of courage, compassion, and respect for the land. Martha listened intently, understanding that these lessons were gifts far beyond food or shelter. They were lessons for life. When the time came for the warriors to leave, the women felt a mix of gratitude and sadness. They had come to rely on the Cheyenne's guidance, but they also understood that the lessons they had learned would remain with them forever. Before leaving, the Cheyenne gathered the women and children together. They spoke of courage, resilience, and unity. Martha felt tears in her eyes as she listened. The warriors had not only saved their lives, they had taught them how to live, how to survive with dignity, and how to face the world with knowledge and courage. The women thanked the Cheyenne, their voices filled with emotion, knowing that they would carry the lessons of the journey with them for the rest of their lives. With the Cheyenne gone, the women faced a new challenge, building a life on their own in the valley. But they were ready. They had survived betrayal, hunger, snowstorms, and fear. They had learned to read the land, care for each other, and teach their children the skills of survival. Martha looked around at the small community they had built, cabins standing firm against the wind, children playing near the stream, and women working side by side. She realized that they were no longer victims of the frontier. They were masters of their own fate. Spring began to arrive slowly, melting the snow and filling the streams with fresh water. The women planted seeds in the thawing soil, their hands busy with hope and determination. The children ran through meadows of green, laughing and learning, their spirits renewed after months of fear. Martha felt a deep satisfaction knowing that the harsh winter had passed and that they had emerged stronger than ever. The valley became more than a place of safety. It became a home. The women worked together to ensure that their community thrived, sharing resources, teaching skills, and caring for the children. Martha often reflected on the journey, on the cruelty they had endured and the kindness they had received. She realized that life on the frontier was never easy, but with courage, knowledge, and community, even the harshest challenges could be overcome. One evening, as the sun set behind the hills, Martha sat with Eliza and the other women near the fire. They shared stories of the journey, laughing at the memories of small mistakes and marveling at the lessons they had learned. The women spoke of the Cheyenne, honoring their guidance and expressing deep gratitude for the lives they had saved. For Martha, it was a moment of reflection, a chance to recognize how far they had come. The children played nearby, their laughter filling the valley with life. Martha felt a deep sense of hope and pride. They had survived what had once seemed impossible. They had faced cruelty, fear, and hunger, yet they had emerged not just alive, but stronger, wiser, and united. The valley, once a place of fear and uncertainty, had become a place of safety, learning, and growth. Martha knew that challenges would continue to come. Life on the frontier was never easy, and there would be storms, hunger, and unexpected hardships. But she also knew that the women, the children, and the community they had built were ready. They had learned the skills, knowledge, and courage necessary to face any obstacle. They had learned that survival was not about waiting for help, but about creating it together. As the night fell over the valley, the women and children gathered around the fire, warm and safe for the first time in many weeks. Martha looked out over the valley, feeling a deep sense of gratitude and peace. They had been abandoned, betrayed, and tested, yet they had survived. The Cheyenne had shown them the power of kindness, knowledge, and courage, and they had used those lessons to build a life for themselves. The stars shone brightly overhead, reflecting in the frozen stream that now sparkled with the first hints of spring. Martha held her child close, feeling the warmth and hope that came from knowing they were safe. She knew that the valley was more than just a place to survive. It was a place to live, to learn, and to grow. And she knew that the women and children, once left to face the harsh frontier alone, had found a new beginning. In that moment, Martha understood the true lesson of their journey. Survival was not just about enduring hardship. It was about courage, unity, knowledge, and hope. They had faced the worst the frontier could offer and had emerged stronger than ever. And as the fire burned and the stars shone above, she knew that they would continue to thrive, teaching their children the lessons of resilience and compassion, and carrying the memory of those who had helped them along the way.